Meghan, you edited an anthology of essays some years ago about the experience of being childless or child-free. Remind me of the title. It was a funny one.
The title was Selfish, Shallow, and Self-Absorbed, 16 Writers on the Decision Not to Have Kids. And I actually didn't come up with the title. Someone else brilliantly came up with the title. But yes, it was ironic in case people don't pick up on that necessarily.
Have your views shifted since then on the kind of the childless, child-free discourse?
They've sort of shifted as I've seen the discourse grow. So the reason I wanted to do the book was I always felt that people who chose not to have kids just had really bad PR. The discourse around it was always, oh, I forgot to have kids. Silly me. Or my child is that, my child drinks out of a bowl on the floor and has 4 feet. Or, that instead of having children, I go on exotic vacations. And that's not the reason anybody ever decided not to have kids. Like if somebody really sat down and did the math and said, well, no, I'm not going to have kids because I would rather have a yacht or, pick up and go wherever I want. That's not really true. And I always thought it was fascinating that there was so much stigma in just saying, you know what, this isn't for me, that it was sort of more acceptable to talk about how selfish and shallow you are. And that's not really true. Like, why is it being honest about this was so taboo? So I wanted to talk about that. And so I put together this collection of writers sort of talking about their own experiences. And of course, that's a little strange too, because they're all writers. So by definition, they're not going to be the norm.
They're all going to be selfish, shallow, and self-absorbed because that's what writers are like.
For other reasons. Yes. Yeah, it was fascinating. And I had wanted to do this project for years. And I was always told by people in the publishing business that there was no audience for this. It was a terrible idea. And in fact, there was a huge audience and it was a bestseller, like in the parenting and childcare category. Parents were fascinated by it too, which I knew they would be. So that was a great experience. So that was back in 2015. But I talk about this a little bit differently now than I used to.
How do you feel about child-free as an expression?
The term, I hate it. I have never used it. I think I say in the introduction to Selfish, Shallow, and Self-Absorbed, did I say? I think I talk about how I don't like to use it. I mean, it just sounds like gluten-free or smoke-free or something. It's kind of like pronouns, perhaps. Like I respect other people's right to use it. And the fact is that we haven't come up with a better solution. I mean, I like to say childless by choice, but that's kind of a mouthful. But I don't like it. There's a lot of jargon around this topic, as there is with most topics. And I hate jargon just kind of generally.
I actually find with using child-free in parallel to using childless as a way of indicating this choice element. I mean, obviously, as I'm sure we'll talk about, that choice, it's not, the dichotomy is not that clear very often, but there are some people who make a really clear decision, I just don't want to have children, and for them maybe child-free is the right word because it does distinguish something quite particular.
Yeah, although it just sounds like protesting too much. Like if you're really okay with this, you don't have to talk about it. And, and that's the thing too, is that when I did the book, I mean, I only had a lot of pain around this issue insofar as I was married and it became an issue in my marriage and it contributed to my divorce. It wasn't the only thing. And I think it's actually, it was the thing that was sort of most legible. Like, this is the problem that was sort of easiest to articulate and for people to see. But, I think ultimately there were other issues. But, once this subject stopped causing me pain on a day-to-day level, I stopped thinking about it. I mean, it's just not something that it's not a political position. It's just my life, and I think that's true. I think a lot of people go through these things regardless of the issue, and they become very political about it because it's causing them personal distress.
This does sometimes happen on the flip side as well. Women who actually are finding motherhood or say stay-at-home motherhood hard and can sometimes respond by protesting a little bit too much.
So that's what they're doing?
Sometimes. Okay. I'm not saying all the time.
You mean by this is the natural thing to do?
Yeah, like by really,
you're selfish if you don't do
really
it.
hammering away at the trad wife thing. Sometimes that is coming from the fact that actually they're having a hard time. And I think that's a human thing. It's maybe more of a female thing to do as well. I think maybe men do that a little bit less.
It's a cope, as you guys would say. The funny thing with men is, so the other thing that I've talked about around this issue is that people always say, well, women are get the burden of these pressures, and nobody ever told a man that he was selfish for not having kids. I don't think that's true at all. I think that men, depending on your sort of social circles, I think that women can get the you go girl thing if they say they don't want to have kids, but men are accused of being Peter Pans. Like, oh, he just won't grow up. He's shirking responsibility. And it doesn't get painted in an empowering way at all. It's just like he's being a selfish loser. So I think people need to make sure they think about that. But I also noticed that, like, especially if on social media or something, when this issue comes up, maybe it's just what I'm seeing, but 9 times out of 10, the this has changed my life. I'm a better person than I used to be. My kids are my world. I would never go back to the way I was before. 9 times out of 10, that's coming from men. And I think that that's telling. And obviously everybody's different, but I wonder if the fact that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons for this, right? Because I think men need family life for emotional sustenance on balance more than women do. They don't have friends. I mean, these are all they don't have as many friends or in the same way in general, not everybody. These are the kinds of things we talk about a lot, right? But I think that you could more easily see a man fall into this idea that having a family has utterly transformed him, and his life was terrible before and now it's great in a way that you don't see from women. And partly because women are doing more of the work when the children are very young, especially. Like, sometimes I say, I'd love to be a dad. I could deal with that. I just think I wouldn't be a very
I
good
have a friend
mother.
who says exactly the same thing. who she's still she's 32, so she's this isn't foreclosed by her, but she says, like, oh yeah, I'd love to be a dad. That sounds lush. I mean, men of course do carry economic burdens, that, although I mean less so as time goes by, but certainly traditionally they do.
Yeah, and they do so much more than their fathers did. I mean, that's the thing I see, especially in my generation. I think that men, they'll really get their backs up if you sort of intimate that they're not doing as much as their wives, because they do so much more than their fathers. I mean, my father, I'm Gen X, and it's not like my father did nothing, but I don't think he ever, put a pan on the stove. I don't think he knew how to turn a burner on. So that's just that generation, and so they certainly men do a lot more.
Relatedly, I have a theory. I kind of came up with it yesterday, and I can't really test it, but I'll put it forward anyway to see. We know that relationship breakdown and divorce has become much more common in the last half century, right? So I think the figure in London now is something like half of children will not live with their biological father by the time they turn 15. And obviously this varies by class and race and stuff like that, but it's a phenomenon. And we know that that tracks with women's participation in the labour market, and particularly mothers' participation in the labour market. And the one like feminist way of explaining this phenomenon is that when women are participating in the labour market, they have more financial independence. They can leave. So they can leave abusive men. They have options basically that they don't have when they are not working. I wonder if that is true, but the explanation is a little bit difficult, a little bit different. I wonder if actually there will obviously be cases where women are fleeing abusers and they have their economic options available. I wonder if what's happening more often though, and I've concluded this from looking at a lot of TikTok, is it's actually just very, very difficult to do the 50-50 thing, to do the both of you are working and you're splitting the financial burden. Women are often out earning men, like female breadwinners is like 40% or something, and you're trying to split domestic work and you're trying to split childcare, and you often don't have extended family help because people are living far away and whatever. I think that's just hard, and I think that just makes people argue. Whereas actually the traditional model where the man is definitely responsible for the money side and the woman is definitely responsible for the domestic side, and you're more likely to have the village around you, I think that makes people argue less. I think it might be as simple as that basically people are just coming upon, like, who does the dishes didn't used to be an argument.
Yeah, right? It's kind of like, if you just, I'm thinking almost like an addiction model. Like if you just, if you're constantly trying to like moderate your addiction, it's a constant struggle, right? So if you just take it off the
Yeah, just
table, then it's
go
manageable.
cold
So if you just
turkey.
decide, I'm going to do the dishes and you're going to earn the paycheck, even if it's not ideal and even if it's not, there's, it's problematic in various ways, it's decided, and it's just, it's not, it doesn't have to be taking up brain space anymore. I can see that. Yeah. I mean, it's got a whole bunch of other problems, but I think that that's a fair hypothesis.
An expression that women use quite often on like Reddit, Mumsnet, TikTok kind of social media platforms is that they're a married single mother, meaning that they're doing everything and they just happen to be married. So like they're doing all the domestic stuff, because often it is difficult to persuade men to actually do 50-50 on the domestic stuff, right? And when women are also working full time, they will sometimes reach the conclusion like, what is he bringing to the table here? Now, I think that in reality, actually leaving him, like, women tend to overestimate how easy it would be to find another partner. And actually leaving this guy, the father of your children, is almost certainly going to cause more problems than it solves. But you can see that train of thought from women who are like exhausted basically and feel like they're not getting a fair shake.
And what do you think about this idea that women's standards for domestic tasks are higher than they need to be? I mean, I think we see this all the time. It's like, well, he could, he could vacuum the house, but he's not going to do it the right way. So I might as well do it. And now I'm mad that he didn't do it.
Definitely a phenomenon.
Like,
Yeah.
you see that a lot, and even with childcare too. I mean, I'm curious because there's this idea that, like, the he could pack the kids' lunches, but he's not going to do it the right way. He's not going to take the kid to school and interact with the teacher in the right way or the parents the right way. So I'm just going to do it as the mom, and pretty soon he's not doing anything. And it's hard to break free of
And
that.
sometimes play the martyr because there's some emotional satisfaction in doing that.
Yes, and it's a control thing too, right?
Yeah. I think there's truth on both sides. So the male, yeah. So that's the kind of the defensive male position is her standards are too high. She wants to play the martyr. The defensive female position is he weaponizes his incompetence because he considers this work low status and he doesn't want to do it. I think both sides are partially true, and it probably the balance probably depends on the couple in question. But yeah, I think it would be surprising if one side were completely right and the other were completely wrong on this.
Yeah, as is true for most
Yeah.
things, unfortunately for the algorithm. But yes, it's always both and.
I had Ruby Warrington, who's an author and journalist, on the show recently. She's written about not having children, and one of the things that she said is that she's happily married and her marriage is very important to her, and that actually she felt as if having children would threaten her marriage, that it could be destabilizing, and that so she made a kind of pro-marriage decision partially not to have children. And I mean, looking at the data on, I believe it's the first year after a first baby's born that's the most likely to cause relationship breakdown.
She's fortunate that she has a husband who is on the same page with her, as her, about the children. Yeah, no, I adore Ruby. I loved her book, and I think the way she talks about this is fascinating. She's really articulate and she's really thoughtful, and she has a lot of original insights. Yeah, I can see that, but I also see a lot of marriages that suffer because family. It's a healthy distraction, right? It's a project. So, I mean, I found that I'm divorced. I have a very amicable divorce. And I'm very lucky that way. But I mean, I think one of the things that happens is when you don't have children, your problems are like right in front of your face all the time. So your marriage is just your nose is pressed up against the glass of your own marriage at all times, and you don't have other things to sort of think about or balance it out. And that can be a problem too. I think sometimes you can your marital challenges can look oversized because you don't have any perspective. So there's that. I mean, you can't win. All this stuff is really hard, right? We seem to be in a strange like blip in history. I mean, you talk about this all the time, where we're really changing the rules, and the sexual revolution is just like 5 minutes old at the end of the day. And I'm very interested to see how this will shake out. But yeah, I mean, people, I'm envious of Ruby because she seems to have figured this out with her husband, and that's great.
You ever read this book, The All or Nothing Marriage?
Oh, I don't know
Eli
that.
Finkel, I think, is the writer. It's really interesting. And he argues that the way that ideas of marriage have changed over the centuries, he's looking at the American context, is kind of like ascending Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in really dire, frontier culture kind of situation, people basically depend on their spouses for the survival, like assistance in the basics of food and shelter, and having and keeping their children alive. And then as time goes by, the Victorians come up with much more romantic ideas about companionship marriages and so on. And we've reached the point where we see marriages not just as economic, reproductive, etc. Unions, but as means of self-actualization. And that's hard. Like, that's a really hard thing to ask of a relationship with another person that lasts your whole life. And so that's why he calls it the all or nothing marriage, that what you end up with people who can attain such a marriage, have great marriages, really, really close marriages. But then people have a tendency, if they're not hitting that standard, to bail and to see the marriage as having failed.
Right. So this is like the capstone
Precisely,
marriage
yeah.
versus the cornerstone marriage,
Yeah.
right? I think is it Brad
Mm-hmm.
Wilcox who talks
Mm-hmm.
about that? Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I grew up in a social climate that was very much about the capstone marriage. Like, it would be an embarrassment if you got married certainly before you were 28, maybe even before you were 30, a little bit like, I remember feeling like, okay, if I don't, there was a window maybe between 28 and 32, like you had to hit that window, maybe 28 and 34, like that was the time where you had to meet the right person and settle down. And if you did it any time before then, you were sort of like a rube. And if you did it after that, then you're risking, you've got fertility issues and all this kind
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. And it's such a tyranny. It's rooted in this like really sort of upper middle class bourgeois post-feminist fantasy about self-actualization in your 20s, and meeting the right person because you have achieved a certain professional standard. I mean, I grew up thinking that the older I got and the more established in my career I got, the more attractive I would be to men. And I'm
Sweet
laughing
summer
because it
child.
seems so laughable now. but I mean, I've talked about this with other women. It's like, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to settle down with my boyfriend that I have now when I'm 24, because when I'm 28 or when I'm 30, I'm going to have like a much nicer apartment, and I'm going to have a cool job, and I'm going to have better clothes, and I'm going to know different sorts of people, and I'm going to have so much more to offer. And I think that that mindset, it was very, very rich, in the 80s into the 90s, and into the aughts. And I mean, I'm curious if you have thoughts about when that started to shift. Like, when did we start to relitigate a lot of these ideas? Because it feels like, to me, it's only been in the last maybe even like 5 to 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, I got married when I was 25, and I come from that same
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Big loser, Louise.
right, yeah. Well, it was considered to be a bit weird, and actually, my she didn't say so at the time, but my mother-in-law did say subsequently, like, I was worried you were too young. My husband's a little bit older than me, but even so. Yeah, and it was a kind of countercultural thing to do. I mean, the impression that I get in my social circle, but this is just anecdotal, so these are people who went to fancy universities, is there's a kind of bifurcation that people either marry their university girlfriends and boyfriends. I know quite a lot of people who did that, and do so in their 20s, maybe late 20s, but 20s. And have kids relatively, in their from like 30 onwards, or they don't. And people end up being single for much longer and maybe choose not to have, that there's kind of like you people's roots diverge quite early is just my impression. But then, generally my like education peer group is like 35, so there's still time yet for things to change.
So the thought was that if you don't find somebody when you're at university, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to, when you're out in the professional world in your 20s, it's going to be much harder to find somebody, even though you have the network, you have the connections and the networks from that university.
Yeah, I mean,
and other
maybe
ones.
what's being expressed there is more that the people who, if I was to put it rudely, describing, my team, the marriage early people, is that we may be more temperamentally willing to settle, whereas the other stream are more like, if I'm going to settle down, I want it to be with someone perfect.
Right. So we used to talk about that as getting set in your ways, which is a very old-fashioned way of putting it, but there's no better way to put it. That's absolutely true. I'm an outlier. I mean, I've always been different. I mean, having children has never been a priority. I mean, I certainly, wrestled with it. And, there have been, sort of moments. But I all through my 20s, it was not something I thought about. It was not something I wanted. I had a long, like a 3-year relationship when I was right out of college. There was no way I was going to marry that person, even though he was a bit older and would have wanted that. When I finally did get married, I was 39. I mean, we had met when we were about 35, 36. And even that was hard because, you really like have established patterns and routines, and it's much harder. But I really used to kind of, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say, I would kind of look down on my friends who got married in their 20s. I mean, I was living in New York City in my 20s, and, it was like the Sex in the City era kind of thing. And I had friends from high school who maybe got married in their early to mid 20s. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? And those people actually have much stronger marriages than the people who got married later, who I knew from the city or places like that. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. So I have egg on my face for sure.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. I think statistically the sweet spot is somewhere between like 23 and 33 or something like that.
Oh, well, that's a big window
right,
there.
yeah.
Okay.
But basically,
yeah.
marriages between teenagers don't last.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, unless you're in very conservative cultures, but in kind of second half of the 20th century West, right? And marriages when people are older are also less likely to last, which may be because of this session your ways thing, that people are more, they can more take or leave it, I guess.
But I mean, and I actually just I'm working on an essay about this. There's not, I mean, there's so much discourse now about like people are, walking away from good relationships because they think they can do better, or there's this kind of like emotional dysfunction that's driving this. I mean, for my part, there's not one person that I dated in my 20s and into my 30s that I could have married or should have married or anything like that. So, I mean, I think we need to be very honest about the actual facts on the ground of people's lives. It's nice to say like, oh, well, we're so picky and we're so naive and we need to get serious about this. But, depending on your life and your situation and just luck of the draw, you're going to run into the people you run into. Now, I mean, I wasn't temperamentally, I wasn't looking for somebody to settle down with. So that obviously I was selecting out for those people. Like I would date somebody sort of inappropriate because it was adventurous or interesting or some kind of anthropological journey, so I did a lot of that. But I mean, I know people who went to colleges, went to art school, and there were like, not a lot of straight men there. So they didn't meet any. And certainly before the age of dating apps, you didn't meet people. If you didn't have a wide sort of swath of people in your real life to interact with, it was going to be a lot harder to meet somebody. So I think people need to be kind of a little more charitable about that.
I like to think sometimes, I've said this elsewhere, but about how the Pride and Prejudice characters would experience the post-sexual revolution era. And the person I think about, like Elizabeth Bennet is a perfect example of a woman who does hypergamy really successfully, right? Lydia would be a single mom, like in because there's no way that Mr. Wickham would have married her. But the figure who I think is actually really interesting is Charlotte Lucas, who I'm sure you'll remember for any listeners who have forgotten. She's Elizabeth Protagonist, very pretty, super attractive, whatever. She doesn't want to marry Mr. Collins, who is a boring vicar. So Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth and she says no and goes on to marry Mr. Darcy, famous sex pot. Charlotte, her friend, ends up marrying Mr. Collins, and Elizabeth looks on her with pity. And Charlotte's like, well, I need to marry someone. The reality for women at this period is that they just do most of the time. And he's well off. He's fine. The fact that he's ugly and boring just like doesn't really matter. And nowadays, I don't think Charlotte would marry Mr. Collins. And Mr. Collins might be an incel. And I'm sure Mr. Collins would be sad about that. Would Charlotte be sad about that? No, maybe Charlotte would be better off. I mean, she wouldn't probably end up having children, so she could be regretful on that score. But in terms of not having to be married to Mr. Collins, that probably is a win.
But Charlotte had the temperament to even make that calculation in the first place. So maybe she would regret it. So the character that I'm fascinated by is Lily Bart from the House of Mirth, the Edith Wharton novel from 1905. So she was into hypergamy as well. So Lily, she was very beautiful, but not from a wealthy background. And she was circulating with socialites in New York City. And, but she really had no skills and she couldn't support herself. The only way she could get by was to have wealthy friends and to go out to their country houses and play bridge with them. And she really needed to find a rich man, but she couldn't quite get there. She couldn't quite make herself the ones that liked her. She didn't like, and she ends up, I don't want to give away the end, but there's a quite tragic ending. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the way, so I'm curious, like what you think. I mean, do you think that dating apps sort of solved this for a minute, or online dating, I should say, even before the apps? Like, was there a kind of sweet spot where those were working for people because it allowed them to go outside of their, immediate social circles and interact with a wider range of people before it kind of just went off the cliff?
I wonder if dating apps work for some personalities. So I know I have two good friends who met their husbands through dating apps or dating websites, and that worked fine for them. And they ended up actually basically finding men who were sort of in their social milieu, but just they hadn't happened to have met them. So they were quite well matched in all the boring stuff, boring but important stuff. Whereas I wonder if to some extent, I mean, you'll know that there's this common practice that some women have of basically saying 6 foot and above. Did you know that song that went viral recently? I'm looking for a man in finance, trust fund, blue eyes, 6'5". Did you not hear
6'5"?
Right, you don't use
Wow.
TikTok enough, right?
No, I don't go on TikTok because I think it's like The Ring. Like if I look at it, my eyes are going to burn out.
I know, but I find it to be
quite useful.
Yeah. social sciences research. This was a little song that went viral and people thought it was funny. Someone asked ChatGPT what proportion of men actually work in finance, have blue eyes, have a trust fund, and are 6'5". And the answer was there are 3 men in America, probably, who fit into all those categories just based on the rarity of those different things. 6'5" being actually the rarest, probably.
Yeah, and also like if you have a trust fund, you don't need to work in finance. So I would just pick one of those
Anyway,
yeah.
even doing something like setting 6 foot as an important quality in a man, that massively, I can't remember what proportion of men are over 6 foot, but it's a really small proportion. So immediately you're cutting out a vast swathe of potential suitors who actually, if you met them in person, you might fancy. So I think maybe I wonder if dating apps for men and women bring out for some people bring out their worst qualities. So for some men, it brings out the shopping for conquests instinct. And for some women, it brings out the pathologically picky instinct.
Okay, but who do you think it works for? People who like to go on a lot of dates, I think. People who are just very open.
Yeah. Or people who are being ruthlessly pragmatic, maybe. I mean, that seems, thinking of the 2 friends for whom it worked for, I'd say that characterizes them, that they're very sensible. They don't they're not. I'm sure that they treated finding a husband with the rigor of finding a house or something. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
but that's finding a house is so emotional though,
Okay,
you fall in love with the
finding a
house.
pension
Yeah.
plan.
Okay. Okay. I was going to say the house thing is a good analogy too,
Yeah.
because you know how they always price. They always, people have a search range for, in terms of price when they look for a house, and so the real estate agents know to price it right under, it's like 1,000,099 or something, because you're not gonna go. Your search parameters need to catch it, even though the house is going to sell for 1.5 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the I can't remember what it was called, that documentary on Netflix about the Tinder swindler?
Oh,
It was like a
yes.
couple of years ago, I
Yes.
think, that it came out. And it was basically this guy who'd conned loads of women on Tinder by tricking them into thinking that he was a billionaire, and getting money out of them. And the thing that really characterized all the women who had been successfully conned by him, who were interviewed in the documentary, was that they were all very romantic and very easily swept off their feet by this super desirable, handsome guy arriving in their lives.
Yeah, I watched that, and I don't even know if I finished it because I didn't understand it. Like I just could not understand how these women would fall for that. And it was so like he had supposedly had private jets, and this guy was like Christian Grey level wealthy. He was presenting himself. And I find it very I had a hard time sympathizing with the women, to be honest with
Because they were
you.
too stupid.
Too stupid. Yeah. I mean, I am old enough that there was like the before online dating time and the after, and I just I find it very difficult to take a lot of this stuff seriously, because you just know that you're not dealing in reality. I mean, you're playing a video game.
Do you know people for whom it's worked, though?
Yeah, sure. Oh yeah. I know a lot of people who've met on these things and gotten married, and not just the app, okay Cupid in its time. I mean, I think that when it went to the phones, I think that probably really changed the dynamic. I mean, the swiping element, that was different than sort of like the early stages of, Match.com and OkCupid and eHarmony. That was another one that like you answered all these questions and then they would match you with people. And I think that was owned by, it was Christian. eHarmony is, I think, technically a Christian dating site. And that had a pretty good, I think that worked for some particular kind of person, perhaps. But yeah, I don't envy this generation. It's really, really difficult.
It's a really difficult coordination problem. Like all cultures have to deal with this problem. of how do you get people to meet at the right time and meet the right person. It's an interesting question, about why so many Northeast Asian countries are particularly struggling with this. Going back to the fertility question, people famously not having many kids, right, in South Korea and Japan and so on. But people are also not coupling up. That's really the primary problem, which is then leading to people not having children. That people are I mean, yes, couples are having fewer, but it's also that people seem to be really struggling to coordinate. And I wonder if this might partly be because those Northeast Asian countries are very conformist, and it means that people. I mean, South Korea had such a high birth rate. Like the 1950s, South Korea had a birth rate of like 6 or something, like so high. It's not like
Wow.
people are incapable in these cultures of, there's nothing
Right.
genetic about it or whatever, right? It's clearly cultural, but I wonder if it's because they do tend to be very conformist cultures, which is good in some ways, little low crime, not much litter, things like that. But it also means that when there isn't an easy template for finding someone, when you don't have the like matchmaking sequence that everyone goes through, there seems to be a tendency towards passivity and towards like not doing the. I think in that kind of culture, finding someone requires a degree of boldness and risk taking and like breaking outside of the normal bounds, which is
Yes.
discouraged generally.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Right. It requires imagination about what your life could
and being
be.
and being a bit
Right.
weird and a bit kind of, yeah, if the culture becomes sufficiently low fertility and sufficiently like unromantic, I suppose, where people are just not coupling up, and if the culture is also generally quite conformist, you can see that doubling down on itself.
Yes, but how do you explain the low fertility rates in places like Italy and Spain, which are certainly not
Yeah,
conformist? They're
yeah, yeah.
very
No, the
romantic
main
and very
reason
very sexy.
the main reason for all of this is that affluence leads to low fertility.
Right.
I'm wondering more why South Korea isn't richer than those European countries, or not significantly, and yet has much, much worse. This problem is much, much worse. So maybe it's affluence plus those unique cultural factors.
I mean, you've talked about this a lot too. Like, I wonder what you think about just sort of stuff in the water, stuff that is making people, the combination of porn, which you talk about a lot, and Sarah and I talk about on our podcast. Like, is there just kind of like a perfect storm of endocrine disruptors and sensory, just the dulling effects of our media and our sort of sexual climate? Like, is this all kind of come together and people are just happier to stay at home and wait for their sex robot to come online and sweep them off their feet?
I take the endocrine disruptor stuff seriously, and I think it's definitely having social effects. I mean, one of the interesting effects that it's having is girls starting their periods much earlier than they used to, which I think I wonder if that contributes to a lot of stuff that I wrote about in my first book, and that you'll hear lots of women talking about, women being sexualized when they're really young and finding it really disturbing. Like, you'll be 12 and you'll have breasts and you'll look physically female and you'll get wolf whistled on the street, but you basically have the mind of a child and you don't really have you have no sexual experience, no real sexual desire of your own. You're just like frightened by this. I think that phenomenon is definitely real. In terms of the effects on people coupling them up, I mean, you have to then wonder why, like, ultra Orthodox Jews are not experiencing this, or the Amish are not experiencing this, or all these super fertile subcultures. They drink the same water. So it's happening, but is that,
Oh,
yeah,
right.
but is it the only
Right.
thing? I mean, presumably the Amish do use fewer plastics. Maybe that's a bad example. Someone like the Haredi Jews in London, who just live in normal houses in London, and they're
Hmm.
experiencing all the same pollutants and all the same environmental factors.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, and are they online? I mean,
Oh
it's
yeah, or the
obviously
internet.
it's
Yeah,
all these things
yeah.
combined. I mean, so if you've got, if there are endocrine disruptive effects combined with ubiquitous pornography, combined with, I'm not allowed to talk to a girl in a coffee shop because I'm afraid she's going to Me Too me. I mean, obviously it's a whole bunch of
Mm.
things happening at
Yeah, perfect storm,
once.
as you say.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for I don't want to say there's something to be said for arranged marriage, and then you can pull that out as your clip. But I mean, just the I will be very curious to see maybe in like even 20 years how this landscape has changed, if people are just going to get fed up with this. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that getting offline and not having a smartphone and not using a lot of this stuff is going to become a status symbol. I really think it's going to be like a flex. If you are sophisticated enough or wealthy enough or whatever it is, you're going to be like, well, I don't use any social media and I touch grass all the time. Unfortunately, it's only going to be the wealthy people who are going to afford to do that, or are going to be able to have the kind of, life that allows them the sort of mental discipline to do that. But I don't think this is sustainable. I think people are really, really miserable. And unless we're going to be very nihilistic about it and say the culture is going to just, extinctify itself because of sex dolls and apps. I don't know. I mean, you have an initiative, right? I'm curious to hear about your conservative speed dating or whatever this is. Your matchmaking
So we've
enterprise.
only done one matchmaking event in London, and it did go very well. The reason I haven't done more so far is because I'm pregnant and tired, and I don't really have the capacity to do the stuff. But there is, shout out to the Maiden Mother Matriarch chat community. People are spontaneously organising meetups in their cities, and I'll put out details on the newsletter so people know where and when they are, which are not necessarily explicitly for the purposes of matchmaking. They're just for the purposes of people meeting up, but could also have that purpose. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff really just has to be done in person, because it's quite hard to know whether you fancy someone based on a photo, actually. It's true.
Yeah.
The thing about arranged marriages, I guess what I would probably advocate for is like a guided marriages, where there's a degree of family involvement. There's this funny thing now where when parents have a bad feeling about who their child is marrying, the social expectation is that they will say nothing. At least that's the case in my social circles, I think. And that seems to me like a very historically strange thing.
Well, because everything is child led now, right? So the parents will cede all authority to the child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I guess, because maybe it's the capstone marriage thing as well, that the idea, if the marriage is for the purpose of their child feeling self-actualized, then kind of who am I to judge? Whereas if you're being a bit more hard-headed about it in a different historical context, then the parents might be like, no, this is clearly, not a good economic union, etc.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's happening too is that baby boomers and on really don't like to identify as adults. Like, I think this is what's happening with a lot of the child rearing stuff that we're seeing. Like, to their core, people born after the counterculture revolutions in the 60s, or people who came of age during that time, there's the kids, and then there's the adults. Like, they are not, baby boomers are not going to identify as the man, right? They're always the kids. So even as they're now into their 70s, they are still, in their minds, they are youth, they are hip and cool, and they really don't want to put their foot down and assert themselves, because it's a massive identity crisis. It's like, even if I tell my child that he is not, transgender, for instance, that gives me such an identity crisis, because I feel like I'm Archie Bunker or something like that. And I think we see this all the time. And I don't see that going away. I mean, this is, anybody from now on is going to have a really hard time seeing themselves as an adult. I think there's a crisis of adulthood. Really, nobody wants it. And to me, that's so strange, because I love being an adult. When I was a child, I hated being a child. All I wanted to be was an adult. I mean, part of the reason I don't want kids is because I don't even want to be around them, because I like being around adults. It's a strange thing. But I think, the in-person thing is huge. I mean, I know I've been doing a lot of stuff with that too. I've been running retreats, and it is it is remarkable how hungry people are for in-person connection. And and my listener community and my Unspeakeasy people, they are arranging their own meetups in cities all over the place, and it's fantastic. But I keep saying we need a heterodox dating app, and I don't know why some engineer doesn't step up and do one.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.